the ultimate power of Hall socialism was just that way that it touched its constituents in this very wholesale way. And, we can get into this in more detail later, but, the halls weren't just about propagating politics as we understand it in a traditional sense, and more about building working class consciousness in a variety of ways, none of which ultimately would then trump the other. So being part of the Ukrainian Labor Farmer Temple Association, or the ULFTA, meant that you and your family would enter into a space that would take care of you and engage you in every sense imaginable, right? From shielding you from political repression to teaching you how to Ukrainian dance, right? And that was the political project. And it really brought in a lot of people and forged this almost like impenetrable working class consciousness amongst its members in a way that I'm not really sure that we've seen replicated since. So I think the lesson that we can draw from that is beyond workplace organizing, which is a sort of separate, very important thing. If we want to organize communities, I think it's fruitful to bring people in around something that's already familiar to them, like their ethnicity in this case, and to then offer them something material that is otherwise inaccessible to them under capitalism, right? Whether that's, free dance lessons, literacy classes, or, just a place to go and commiserate, and maybe even turn that into sort of some kind of grassroots collective action. And to also to kind of cast our political nets pretty wide. What made the ULFTA so special was that it didn't force political identity to look a particular way, and it didn't really hit people over the head with the correct line, right? It really focused on building an extensive infrastructure for the community, and it understood that as being very politically useful. And by extension, I think that, that community building made people much more receptive to broader working class solidarity, right? Like if you're part of a group that's meeting your needs and you feel an affection towards them, you want to see others have that too. So it was and is a really good way of countering any sort of resentment that can sometimes prevent folks from joining a cause or engaging in solidarity efforts. And I think more seriously that we might see in sort of more recent times, that might even turn them in the other sort of direction, if you catch my drift. Secondly, I think one of the things that eventually accounts for the ULFTA's demise was this kind of imposition of an authoritarian, kind of centralized, top-down sort of like leadership and sort of political style. Like the third period in particular made it basically impossible to continue with their successful organizing strategies because it prevented them from using things like language and ethnicity as a catalytic factor. I think, there's lessons for this in the contemporary left, not in the sense that we have a common turn, but, in the sense that sometimes I think we can get distracted from expressing working class power, or we inadvertently squash organic expressions of working class consciousness or culture because we're too focused on, like getting the line correct or increasing members or union dues and so on. And then lastly, very quickly, I think there's something to be said. Sorry, I'm very excited about the ULFTA, but I think there's something to be said for the praxis of the Ukrainian left when it was at its peak, right? Everything was done through direct collective action by members for other members. And there was basically no social mediation or reliance on formal politicking, right? And I don't think I need to sort of like tell anyone here that that's a sort of good strategy for organizing in today's climate. So
amazing. There's a few threads I just want to try to condense into a quick follow-up, which is, but just generically, like if I was going to start a community hall that provided the sort of like food for the soul, food for the body, etc., and that created this more holistic context of sort of mutual aid and solidarity that you're talking about, and obviously also political development. I feel like the things that I would immediately run into would be that, well, first of all, that there's already a bunch of spaces like that the government is funding, or that like local local elites, within any particular community are sort of managing. And then there's a whole layer of like NGOs that are there to sort of provide a bunch of those services, and so on. So there's this whole pre-cooptive layer that's already in place that makes it very hard to break through and actually meet a need, because needs are being met, but in this very like siloed sort of professionalized ways. And so I guess I'm curious, is there something about the context in which hall socialism happened that made it where there was more of a vacuum, maybe where those needs weren't being addressed at all, and so there was a lot more of a kind of a wide open terrain in order to be able to establish these kinds of spaces, or were there similar things happening back then too?
I'm trying to figure out whether, how to sort of frame this, but I'm not sure that there's a right or wrong answer. So I'll just sort of maybe say a few things all at once, and then we can decide together what we think of it. But I think there is something very context, time, and place specific to what hall socialism was able to accomplish. I was thinking about this actually when we sort of briefly touched on the labor temple in Thunder Bay, and I think one of the really successful things about the labor temples was that they kind of existed in this very particular moment in the settler colonial project, where you and your comrades could just like buy this super cheap piece of land and like throw up a labor temple on the weekend. And that's not something that we can really do anymore. I don't think the collective left in Toronto could afford one building here. Saku can talk a bit more about the way this is, if you want, that these things were really complicated in Thunder Bay. So I think that in that sense, there's something very specific about when these things appeared that made them possible that I'm not sure we could quite physically recreate, forget all the kind of like accoutrement that then goes on inside. But then, at the same time, at least in the Ukrainian case, there weren't, formalized NGOs in the same way, but there were community elites who created their own competing organizations and halls. Particularly in the 1930s onwards, we saw government bureaucracies established around trying to acculturate Ukrainians and to particularly instill in them anti-communism. And so there were a lot of those same things. But I think what really drew people into the labor temple specifically was that it was just explicitly leftist, right? And that was there had to be that, right? Like you wouldn't enter those halls if you were, like a conservative Ukrainian, but you just like really wanted to do culture, right? Like you wouldn't go there. So I think it is possible in the sense that if we created like explicitly leftist spaces that then serviced maybe these other things, maybe not ethnicity as you say, but other things, that we could recreate some of that sort of like organic grassroots like community building. But yeah, so I think it's like both very context specific, but also we've seen these things before and we can work around them. I don't know if that's helpful, but
yeah, no, definitely helps set the stage. Saku, do you have any reactions to that?
I mean, the conditions that led to the rise of hall socialism in North America, they can't be recreated. The Finns, a lot of the Finns that came over, a drop in the bucket really when you compare it to other immigrant groups, 300,000 or so before 1914, so before the First World War. And they were fleeing Tsarist repression. I mean, they're basically leaving. Finland at that time was not an independent nation state. So they were leaving at a highly politically charged time. And they had experiences that we can't recreate today. And I imagine it's much the same in the Ukrainian context. But having said that, I mean, I've been fortunate enough to visit a number of social centers in Europe, in Italy and Greece, in the UK and Finland, and other locations where I think if you took somebody from the early 20th century and you dropped them into a social center in Europe, I think they'd see a lot of familiar things. There'd be a lot to sort of identify with there. So I do see that, you know, there in certain parts of the world, and maybe even Canada, perhaps in a slightly different form, we see these kinds of community centers functioning, but in a different way. And you touched on the role of the state and the way that you know, you have these sort of double-edged swords where you see the expansion of the welfare state and a lot of gains for working class people. But at the same time, it comes with a kind of a political cost where a lot of these movements then become very bureaucratized, and that's very foreign to the whole socialism experience. These were very democratic spaces and extremely participatory spaces as well. So I see some differences today, but you know, some examples I think that are similar to the whole socialism experience.